glad to be here this morning. Omidyar network has engaged with Dasara for the past couple of years, and we're very proud of our association with Dasara. Dasara has already made very important contributions to the growth of this sector, and even more importantly, engaging a whole bunch of people in the philanthropic space who were otherwise not so engaged, or perhaps not so engaged in a very structured way that Dasara has been able to engage all of us. So thank you, Dasara, for all of the wonderful work that you're doing. I wanted to add to Tarun's point about the Dasara governance fund that's being put together. 50 crore seems like a big number given how little funding there is for governance in general in India at this time. And there's some breaking news, if I might, Tarun. We've got another 6 crore added to the 10 crore. So we've got about 16 crore, and congratulations to Dasara for... so this was a commitment from the Azim Premji Philanthropy Initiative. This just happened. So we hope we'll chug along and get to the 50 crore over the next couple of years, hopefully sooner. Hopefully by the end of the day. That's like a good target to have. But with all of us here, we should be able to pull that off, hopefully. Deval wrote me a long email about what I should say. That made my job easier. Deval, thank you for that. He actually said, talk about your journey because that's the story that I'd want people to know. And so I'm wondering where I should start. I'm a little bit nervous. But perhaps I should start with a bit of a story that I've never told before. And might give you a little bit of context about sort of my own evolution in the space so far. When I was about 15 years old, it might take some time for me to say all my life story. 15 years old, my father had, I come from a place called Kolar Goldfields outside of Bangalore. My father was a professor of English. He had gone to Bangalore for some work. His friend and he decided they'd meet at a bookstore in Bangalore. And my father went into the bookstore and he was waiting for his friend to arrive. And so when his friend arrives, he sees this sort of six-story building collapse right in front of his eyes. And so he wasn't sure whether my father was inside or not, because those are not the days of telephones and cell phones. So he wrote an impassioned, sort of hurried letter to, my father was a professor of English, to the college in KGF and to our home saying, Mr. Vibhakar, I'm worried, are you safe? And so we had no idea my father had gone there, so we just looked at the letter and brushed it aside, and he didn't show up for a couple of days back from Bangalore, and we were wondering what happened. So we got suspicious, added things together, and turns out that after searching for about a week, discovered that he might have actually been there. And it turns out, as the excavation happened, they found his sort of bag that he was carrying at the, when you enter a bookstore, you leave the bag outside, right? So they found his bag, so we figured out that he must have been trapped somewhere in the debris. 26 days later, we found his body and cremated him and all of that. But one of the things that happened when he died was we were not ever very wealthy. So a lot of his students in the college and professors got together and said, look, he was the lone breadwinner for the family and he had done much for the community. So a lot of people sort of got together and said, we need to find ways to contribute to the family. So they gave him 10 rupees, 20 rupees, 100 rupees, 500 rupees. In those days, 1983, big, not insignificant amounts. So part of my education was funded with all of that money. So when I look back at those days, then I went on to get a degree in engineering, went to the US, took a loan, waited tables, got my education, got my MBA. When I went to the US, I told my mother, I want to go make some money. I won't come back for 10 years. So she was a little surprised. She said, fine. But then I went for my MBA, and as I was going through the program, something struck me that, there's so much more to do in India. You could do an MBA, get into corporate life. So I decided I'd come back. I'd say to my mother was somewhat disappointed. She thought we might be better off if I stayed there for some time. I came back and started actually working with ICICI Securities. I had a degree in finance. And so I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to do something. So I came back and started with ISEC. And, within the first year, I was volunteering for UNICEF in Houston when I was studying. I came back and I went to the UNICEF office here in Mumbai and said, I'd like to volunteer. I'm taking up a job in ICICI Securities. Whatever time I might have, I'm happy to come and volunteer. They said, Richard Bridle, who was heading the UNICEF office in Mumbai at that time, very excellent guy. He said, we don't take volunteers. I said, all right. So over the next year, I actually went around meeting with NGOs, meeting with people in government. What's a good way for me to contribute? Right? That was my sort of quest in some ways. So I met a number of people, did field visits, spoke to people, all of that. But then at the end of the year or so, Richard Bridle called me one day and said, we're starting this new initiative called Pratham. And maybe you should get involved. So the Pratham office hadn't been set up yet in Vaibhi Chavan Center. So when I met Madhav and Farida, the first question I asked them, apparently, which Farida still teases me, was, how large is Pratham? And so my question really was, as Madhav elegantly later put it, there's a book called Small is Beautiful. I don't know if many of us have read it. So certainly people of my generation or older might have. So Madhav would say, small is beautiful, but large is useful. So in some ways, I was in quest for scale, not because of any devious ambition, really, but really that if we could put all our minds and energies together, we should solve a larger problem. So I started volunteering with Pratham for some years, and all of my evenings, I used to go back by the last train to Malad in those ICICI quarters in those days. I did that for a couple of years, and I said, look, as I'm doing this, learning about many initiatives that are going on in the rest of the country on water, on health. So I took leave of absence from ICICI without pay, and then decided I would travel to many of these places to understand what it took to scale some of those initiatives in water or education, better panchayats, etc., etc. As I was doing this, Mr. Vagul, who was chairman of ICICI, we had roped him in as chairman of Pratham as well, called one day and said, Madhukar, Pratham really needs you, why don't you come back? And we'll second you from ICICI to work with Pratham. So I said, best of both worlds. So I came back. So for the next 4 years, I was full-time with Pratham from 96 to 2000, and getting a banker's salary, not a bad deal at all. Around that time, the government of Karnataka wanted to set up something called, something like Pratham in Bangalore, and so the government wanted to reach out to us and see if we could help in some way. So we decided we'd help set up something called the Akshara Foundation in Bangalore. I don't know if Rohini is here yet. So I went and met Rohini and Nandan at that point in time. And Rohini said, we'll do this. And I reached out to several others in the corporate sector. They all began to chip in, but Rohini was there to back it. So we set up Akshara Foundation. I was still in Mumbai, and Mr. Premji was planning to set up his Azim Premji Foundation. And so Mr. Premji, came to Mumbai, spent a whole day in the communities in Mumbai, looking at schools and walking around in the slums. And so at the end of the day, he asked Madhukar if I could move to Bangalore to help set up the Azim Premji Foundation. I was 29 or 30 or something like that. I felt very fortunate. So I told Mr. Premji, you should really talk to Mr. Vagul because I can't decide on this. So finally, I moved to Bangalore. So Mr. Premji asked me one question. What do you plan to do long term? So I said, I want to do something in governance and policy. So I said, what is it specifically that you want to do? I said, look, in all of the work in education I've done, it seems to me that some of the bottlenecks clearly are at the policy level, and the multiplier impact of bad policy or good policy is huge, and therefore we should do something to correct policy. So he looked at me and said, can you give me 3 years at least? So I said, no problem, I can give you any number of years because I have no plan as to what I might do. So it turns out that exactly at the end of 3 years, I moved to the US to study further and come back to India, by which time, as I looked at all of the things that were going on, I was getting more and more convinced that we need to find ways of changing the debate of our politicians. We have one after this coming up on stage, and he'll speak a very different language. So the idea of PRS was essentially to say, if you want to change the discourse that politicians have, what do you need to do? You could, of course, intervene at the election time and see how you can, have these televised debates like in the US. But also maybe you could set up something more sustainable and something ongoing about what happens in Parliament. And so that was how the idea of PRS was born. And over the next couple of years, spoke to several, dozens of people in India, in the US. So we came back in 2005 to set up India's Parliamentary Research Service. So when I was coming back, I had reached out to a bunch of people I'd worked with in the past, high net worth folks, business leaders. And turns out people would say, good idea, but I'm not sure that I should get engaged. So I was trying to convince people, look, this is non-partisan, non-confrontational. And if we don't do it, who's going to do it? So I visited India from the US once before I formally moved back. I went and met the Ford Foundation. And the gentleman in Ford said, I think it's worth betting. I think it's worth backing for 2 years. And if something works, we can double down. So people would always ask me, you might do all of the excellent research on legislation that comes up, but these MPs and politicians. So I would have no answer to that. So thankfully, the moment we started, we reached out to a bunch of MPs. I was a newbie to Delhi. Madhavan, my colleague, and I would knock on doors, meet people. They'd be very polite, give us a cup of tea and say, thank you very much. Never sort of got anything from them. Heard back from them for a while, for 6 months. But then gradually one thing led to the other. And PRS today works with about 400 MPs across parties on a pretty regular basis. My colleague Chakshu was here yesterday, and he was telling me much of the details about what was going on. It continues to do very impressive work. I wonder sometimes how come we never had a research service to brief our MPs about legislation for 60 years and we expected them to do all the right things in Parliament. Our MPs, like all of us, come from very different backgrounds. If there's a discussion on the Nuclear Liability Bill or the Reserve Bank Amendment Act, we cannot all be proficient in everything that we have that comes up before Parliament. So as we grew our work in PRS, Google, a friend of mine, some of you might know her, Sonal Shah, was at google.org for some time. I was in the office. She literally knocked on my door one day and said, Madhukar, I want to give you money. I said, great. So she said, I'm coming back in October and let's catch up. So Google ended up giving us some money. My former colleague, now Minister of State, Jayant Sinha, is an old friend. So Jayant called me when he took up his assignment at Omidyar to set up the India office. He called me when he first landed to set up the Omidyar office and said, Madhukar, we want to give you money. I said, great, we'll take it. in all of this time, this is already 5 years into our work, we didn't have a single contribution from anyone in India, a single penny. So we got these 3 letters of commitment, renewed commitment from Ford, Omidyar, IDRC had said we'd give you more money. So we applied to the government of India for FCRA permission. The government sat on it for about a year and then said, we won't give it to you. You work too closely with the members of parliament. We think it's too sensitive. Of course, we were all making these intellectual arguments. You're infantilizing MPs. Don't you think they can think for themselves? In any case, that's the government, so they decided they won't give the FCRA permission. So we were at a stage for the next 8 months. 25th of every month would be scrambling to make the next payroll. So Madhavan and I would frantically call and use up all of the goodwill we had. Fortunately this time we had a track record of being non-partisan, of having been of service to hundreds of MPs across party lines. People started giving from within India. And thankfully today, PRS is reasonably well funded, thanks to the generous support of many of you in the room. PRS survives and thrives and does well and adds value to our parliament on a daily basis, including as of yesterday. The reason I mentioned some of this is really to bring our focus back on governance and the genesis of PRS and the idea that policy is important. I don't know if it started in my head when my father passed away. I have no idea. At some point, clearly, it seemed to me that perhaps if there was better governance, that building that was building the 2 extra illegal floors that it was building at the time might have been prevented. Perhaps somewhere the death of Manjunath, who many of us know, might not have happened. Is that a governance question? Is that a question of simple, better administration? Is it a question of us being a little bit more vigilant as citizens, a little bit more engaged? We've got a fantastic democracy. As somebody said, democracy is not a spectator sport. We need to engage. How do we engage is a question. Some of us can go down and do all of the work. Some of us are doing other important things, but have the wealth and wherewithal to support these kinds of initiatives. So, the couple of things that come to mind really is, I think we all have a role to play. Some of us might do the work, some of us might be able to give money, some of us might be able to open doors, some of us might be able to use our influence to do the right thing. The field is wide open, and I do want to make the point that our democracy is best saved with Indian money, and not so much, not to take away from the important contributions that Ford or Omidyar or others have made in our journey as a democracy, however small and important they might be. But if we can't own the one thing that we're all proud of, that's our democracy, how do we expect us to improve? How do we us to get better? Do we want foreign money to come and say, improve your electoral process because we think it's important, or do we think that we should put in our money and minds to make sure our electoral process is better? I think it's a matter of a bit of a national pride. I'm sorry to be invoking that, but it is a matter of national honor in some ways, that we ought to safeguard our democracy. I just want to thank all of you for the patient hearing. And I'm around all of today with all of you, and would be happy to chat at any point in time. I do hope that all of you will be generous about how you might want to engage in your different ways. Certainly make sure that Dasara gets its 50 crore and more for governance. And I hope all of that will just be a beginning for what will be a long and impactful story on governance. Thank you very much, David.